Well, howdy, folks. You're back for another episode of Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson. And, folks, I'm here with Andrew Seidel. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to be here with you.
Folks, Andrew's packing a pretty long resume. He's a constitutional attorney, but he's also an award-winning environmental lawyer. So we're going to have to touch on that. He's been the director of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the director of Freedom for Religion Foundation, but I think I have those flipped. You
I'm
were.
vice president at AU right now, and then
Right now.
I was my title at FFRF was director of strategic response, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your service. When he is not fighting the government and religion, he's writing books about it. And we are going to cover that, folks. These are two amazing books. This is on the Supreme Court. This is on really like original documents and the founding of America. But this goes into what is the real history versus what do a lot of Christian nationalists like to pretend is the history. He is also was a Grand Canyon guide and nature photographer. So thank goodness you are getting some nature after battling some pretty intense forces. Tell us how you went to Tulane. You also went to Denver. How did you get into being a Grand Canyon guide somewhere in the middle of law school?
Yeah, so it is a strange kind of but to me the line between fighting Christian nationalism and fighting for the separation of church and state, there's a pretty direct connection between that and my love of the environment and environmental science. But yeah, I mean, so the short version is in undergrad I was going to be a doctor. I was going to do ER trauma surgery. I did all my pre-med requirements, organic chemistry. I worked in hospitals. I worked as an EMT. And I loved that stuff too, but I got a little disenchanted with the American medical system. No shame to any of our brilliant, brave frontline workers out there. I just decided it kind of wasn't for me. But I did want to save the world. So, getting into environmental protection. So I got my second BS while at Tulane in environmental studies, environmental science. First one was in neuroscience. And right after that, I did a bunch of photography and became a Grand Canyon tour guide. And I had a couple in my van who, one of my tours, they were environmental attorneys, both of them. And they're like, hey, man, you got to go. Like, we've been talking for 12 hours all day long. And by the end of it, I was dropping them off at their hotel and they're like, you got to go to law school and you got to do environmental law. They were like, just go look up when the LSAT is and take it and, take the next steps. And so I did. And it turned out the LSAT was 3 days away. It was that weekend. So I signed up, I went and took a practice test at a Barnes & Noble using one of the prep books, did well, applied to Tulane. And I applied to Tulane and a couple other schools with strong environmental programs. But while all that was happening, Katrina hit New Orleans. And so I was the first class back after Katrina. And so when Tulane accepted me, I wanted to go back and do what I could for the city to help it rebuild. And I mean, I really loved environmental law, and I learned so much. I did some really cool things at the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, including suing Murphy Oil over their violations of the Clean Air Act in a kind of groundbreaking case there. And also was learning more and more about the First Amendment and the separation of church and state and free speech and religious freedom, real religious freedom, not that religious freedom that we hear about today where it's like, I get to impose my religion on you, or I get to violate your rights or harm you. Not that. That's not religious freedom. And I started seeing kind of this connection. And my 3L year, right around the time I was graduating, and I was bringing that case against Murphy Oil, I remember seeing Representative Shimkus from Illinois, and I don't remember which House subcommittee. It was one of the environment subcommittees. He's chair of this committee, and he invokes the Bible to say that we don't have to worry about climate change anymore. And it's not just that he invokes the Bible, he invokes the story of Noah's flood. He says, like, God promised after he flooded the earth and killed everybody that he wasn't going to do it again. So we don't have to worry about, like, and this is a person that is directing public policy on the environment, citing the Bible. And I mean, that was just, for me, that was the precipitating event. And but you go back, and that is a very, very common view. Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, said it's my responsibility to follow scriptures which call upon us to occupy the land until Jesus returns. So you can go back, to the Rockefeller, but you can also, fast forward to some of the more modern folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has said some reasonably crazy stuff. Remember her whole, there's a whole debate about who controls the skies. Do we believe that God has a dominion, or like, is it humans? And this is kind of one of the constant conflicts, is God gave humans dominion over the earth, and we have a duty to harvest it, and everything's going to be fine because he promised us that. There are some, Stephanie Borowitz, who's a representative out of Pennsylvania, a state representative, has said some really out there things. Representative Mary Miller, who's a U.S. representative out of Illinois, climate change is a sham. God controls the climate. And also affiliated with January 6th. I mean, and then, so you can trace that thread really back to kind of this modern wave of Christian nationalism that pops up around the 70s. I remember that when I was doing this research, I found Jim Baker, right, the televangelist, saying this global warming business is anti-God. And a lot of people are not going to accept the second coming because they're going to call it global warming or something like that. I mean, so it to me, it really is clear that there's this connection. And I think the connection is, and I promise I'll let you talk, I'll be done telling my story in a minute, but the connection is that Christian nationalism at its heart, right? This idea that America is founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Judeo-Christian principles, and that our public policy has to reflect that. It is a permission structure for all kinds of evil, harmful things to be done by people with power. Whether that is saying that businesses get to discriminate against LGBTQ people, whether that is raiding the U.S. Capitol to try to overturn the results of a free and fair election, or, raping the planet Earth because God gave it to us, so no reason to not do that. And it's that permission structure that makes Christian nationalism so pernicious these days in the United States.
Yes. I wrote a paper last spring that was a finalist for a conference in Appalachia, and it was a Christian conference. And I listened to one of the keynote speakers as I was there, and she just had a really interesting story, and like her pulpit, she was someone who deeply cared about the environment, but she refused to use the word climate change because who she speaks to are these conservative audiences, these Christian, and she's trying to go in and like reshape it and be like, no, actually, like there's a lot of biblical argument for being responsible stewards of the earth, and like here's all the other instructions that you guys are like not looking at. And I watch people like perk up, and it really like, and a lot of people are like, wow, I never thought about it that way. And it really made me realize like the only way to really show some people is like, like the only way is like through biblical scripture. And I was like, this is, and while I'm thankful for her and her role, I was like, that we can't just use a very contradicting document in and of itself to then continue justifying why we believe in certain value. Like, and like you said, it's like a lot of the same arguments. And I'm sure, like, as you've covered in this book, like this book was supposed to be the book that was to end all of these arguments. Do you feel like they were like, oh, we'll re-strategize, or?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I wrote The Founding Myth because I have these arguments, 10 times a day, every day of the week, about was America founded as a Christian nation? You know, is our law based on the Ten Commandments? Were we founded on Judeo-Christian principles? Did the founding fathers pray during the Constitutional Convention? Does the Declaration of Independence reference the Christian God 4 different times? No, 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 no. And you know, I kept having these same debates, and I'm like, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to end this debate because I think there are a lot of people, especially, you know, kind of in the secular movement, who maybe understand the facts there, right? Like they know that "In God We Trust" was added to the pledge in the 1950s and adopted as the national motto then, right? But it's not just that we need better facts. We also need better arguments. We need arguments that are emotional, that are gut punches, that don't just focus on, like, if all we needed were facts, propaganda would never work, but it does work, and it works because it plays to humans' emotions. We are not the rational beings we like to think of ourselves as. Even those of us who, you know, reject superstition and religion, things like that, you're still an emotional being. You just are. And I wrote the book thinking, like, yeah, you know what, it's going to be a bummer because I've got all these arguments down. I win these arguments every day, but they're going to come up with all this new stuff, and it's going to be playing whack-a-mole. And it hasn't. They've got no new arguments. I mean, they really don't. They've got nothing. They just want something to tell themselves that fits that we're a Christian nation, because then it allows them to believe that permission structure and then do all of the other things that we talked about, from the, you know, the child separation at the policy at the border to January 6th.
It's and one thing that I noticed, so my audience knows I'm writing a book on Christian nationalism and U.S. military chaplaincy, and doing so, reading all sorts of books, including yours. Guys, go check this out. We'll do a proper promo at the end, but I'm pointing behind me because that's my stack of books. But I have been reading the books authored by Pete Hegseth, and
The
it
Other American
is
Crusade, also his book title.
yes, yeah, that was actually pretty funny to get all y'all's books in like the same week, and I was like, and how much better your book was than his book by like, because on like to your point, and actually just changing the story, changing whatever. What I notice is like online, and probably what you've faced quite a bit, are people with those sorts of questions, like. And interestingly enough, in Hegseth's book, he actually totally owns that it was separation of church and state, like pretty well, but then spends the rest of the book arguing against it. And that's why we need to deconstruct it. And I thought that was very peculiar because other people don't know, like now that there's two Christian nationalist stories going on, right? The power that's like, oh yeah, it happened. We're just going to crush it. And then the people that are now believing that the liberals somehow misguided them in the last 100 years, and now we're all lost. And it's like, and it was scary to come up on that piece of research and be like, because it's his audience, I don't think, I mean, he was on Fox News, but I think a lot of his audience were other rich, white, conservative Christian men, and that were probably educated, that were like, yeah, you can't lie. Like, so it's
Well, I mean,
interesting how.
like if you read them, the founders were clear. Like, there's not a real way to get around it. Like, I mean, like James Madison writes, like in his detached memoranda, is the appointment of chaplains to the military and the two houses of Congress consistent with the Constitution and religious freedom? Nope. He, like, in the strictest case, the answer must be in the negative. Like, it's like he asks the question and says, yeah, no, we can't do this. It's not constitutional. So I mean, they are, you know, the founding fathers were very clear, and you know, as a constitutional attorney, I'll be the first to admit there's so much wrong with our Constitution. There's a lot that, like, if we were writing it today, we could easily make significantly better. But that wall of separation between church and state, that's an American original. That's an American invention, right? The idea was floating around during the Enlightenment, but it was never implemented until the American experiment. Until then, no other nation in the history of the world had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. And I actually think, like, that is something that we can be proud of as a country. And I don't think we should let people undermine it with myths about a Christian being founded as a Christian nation.
Oh, and to build on that, that's exactly what my paper was for that spring conference in that Christian was saying, like, separation of church and state is what has allowed so many. I mean, our denomination would not be here. We were created in
Hmm.
1832. Like, so this is if we're and that's why it was there, 'cause but, it's really concerning, particularly when you want to blend the history, how much threat that is, not just for citizens, like a free citizen, but I don't want the state in the church. I don't want the lawyers telling a bishop what is true and what is like, and that does get a little bit hairy, and maybe you can shed some light onto this. There was, some murmur last year about this administration possibly changing how they would handle clergy misconduct. Like, they would keep it like the state would not intervene. Have you heard much about that? About how Trump was trying to give clergy more protections?
Yeah, there was a law, I believe it was Washington, though it could have been Oregon, but I think it was Washington, which is a mandatory reporter law, which is right. Like if you hear about child abuse and you are in a certain profession, you are required to report that to the authorities, right? The secular authorities, police. And so this is for things like doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, teachers, the people that have that kind of position of both authority but of trust over children and with other people. And Washington included clergy in that, so that if you were a Catholic priest and you were made aware of the rape of a child, you had to report that to the police, the secular authorities. And what Trump's administration did, and there was a huge uproar about it, was wade in and say, we are going to sue you if you pass this. Absolutely not. And I don't remember all of the details of the actual fight, but that particular part of the law is on hold right now, is my recollection. But nobody should quote me on that. They should go look up for themselves. And I mean, it's kind of mind blowing because the the current place that we are in as a society is that religious freedom is being rewritten as a license to discriminate and harm others. And that is just so far from what it was envisioned by the founders and what it was at the time. They wanted religious freedom, yes, but not as a license to hurt other people, and not as a license to be like a bad citizen. And there's actually this, Thomas Jefferson wrote this really kind of esoteric piece on this where he actually talks about like imagine a town under siege. Or imagine like a religious freedom example where somebody wants to do human sacrifice, right? Like, and human sacrifice is at the one of my law professor friends said this. It's a slippery slope when you're talking about religious freedom to get to human sacrifice, because like all the discussions end there. But the point being, like, you may believe that God is telling you to kill somebody, right? Like the angel tells Abraham that he has to kill Isaac, right? Like it's not uncommon. You don't get to do that. Your religious freedom does not include that right. It doesn't include the right to harm others, to violate their rights, to kill them. Let's take a simpler example. Imagine two Mormons come up to your door of the house that you own on your property, and you say, thanks, but no thanks. And they say, oh, sorry, we are required by our religion, by our God, to proselytize, and we are going to stand here until you listen to us. And they set up camp on your front walk. Like, you still have the right to get them kicked off your property. You can call the cops. They're trespassing. Like, your property rights are not trumped by their religious freedom rights, which is an example that you can get most conservatives to agree to because they're big on property rights usually. And this is the answer to so many of the questions that kind of surround the religious freedom questions today, and that go to the question that you just asked me, like, right? Like, your religious freedom does not include the right to harm children. And by not reporting on the harm of children, you are harming children. You just are. Your religious freedom does not include the right to risk the health and safety of an entire community because you think vaccines don't make sense or masks are of the devil or any of those things, right? Like, your right to swing your religious freedom, to exercise your religion, ends where the rights of other people begin. And that has always been the case in this country. And that is what we are seeing turned on its head by the Supreme Court. And that's what American Crusade, my second book, is really all about, kind of exploring that weaponizing of this hallowed concept.
And you're right, because they can use it, whether it's vaccines, whether it's proselytizing. You wrote, and one thing that I picked up on as someone in Montana was the school voucher up in
Yeah.
Kalispell.
Yeah.
So it's a full front, and what's really particularly interesting about it is, as much like you pointed out, it's not only to protect, Christian nation from, other religions, but from Christian sects from each other. That's why there were so many different Christians in the room with the deists and with everybody else during those times. Um, and what you're saying about being emotional, Pete Hegseth's book was just like, I had to put it down because, like, it felt like he was yelling at me and I
Yeah.
would just, like, and
I'm
I'd
not
pick it back and I'd be like,
surprised.
I have to read this quote, like, but like with yours, it was just so dense. Like, I was like, and great and factual. And I would be like, I don't, there's just, like you said, the answer is no, it's not a Christian country. Like, so.
Yeah. I don't think there really is a good argument otherwise. I've debated folks about this before. And it's just they have no new arguments under the sun. There's no real, like, the closest you'll get is like, oh well, there were a lot of Christians at the founding, and Christianity influenced our language and culture. And, like, yeah, sure, no, fine. Like, nobody's contesting that, but did it shape our laws and government? And the answer there is just no. There's no evidence to suggest that it did. In my day job at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, we're litigating all of these cases about the Ten Commandments being displayed in public schools in Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas. And it's like, one of the main arguments is they're the basis of all American law. And it's like, then why did the founding fathers not mention them a single time during the debate to write our Constitution? We have all the records. We got all their letters. We know what they said. The Ten Commandments don't come up once. Hell, the Bible barely gets a mention, and it's just Ben Franklin kind of repeating this one biblical story, not because it shows some theological truth, but because it's kind of like a good story to make his point. Like, it's not there. It's just not there because it didn't have any influence.
No, and I can see why they would, if there were like biblical stories that would come up, would be Exodus related, right? Like, they see themselves as
Uh-huh.
fleeing and getting out of America, of the British tyranny. But, like, they're not sitting there going down rabbit holes of Job, and or like, these aren't like Bible studies. Um, yeah, one of the things that you talk about, and I'm glad you brought up the Ten Commandments, is that the Ten Commandments are in the Bible 4 times, twice in Exodus, twice in Deuteronomy. You go and show the full length, you show how they're different and compared to one another, and then you spend a dedicated section, and I'm not kidding, folks, it's very well done, going through how how each of the 10 commandments does not line up with the Bill of Rights or the Constitution in some way. And I was like, my gosh, he's right. Like, um, and particularly when it talks about, you will have no other God before me, and direct
Yeah.
violation of freedom of conscience. I mean,
Yeah.
that is, and I've never even made that connection, and you did. And I was like, oh, obviously. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
My pleasure. I mean, it would be difficult to write a law that is more in conflict with America's founding principles than "I am the Lord your God; you shall have no other gods before me." It's the antithesis of what this country stands for. And then if you actually go and read what people consider the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, it's not just that. They also, God in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 promises to punish innocent children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, great great grandchildren for the crime of their parents which is just gross, right? Like punishing kids for what their parents did is just gross and also un-American. But the crime that they would be guilty of that would require this punishment is exercising their religious freedom. Like it is, if you actually spend the time to just read through what people think of as the Ten Commandments and just spend a little bit of time thinking about how those stack up against America's principles, the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to worship, separation of church and state. It is mind-blowing how little they share in common and how often they contradict one another.
And like, and kind of one of the things that I noticed while in Pakistan for my listeners abroad, is that when you start talking about and going back to the same thing of Christian sex and is I thought Sharia law, like kind of like biblical law, like Sharia law is or Sharia law is interpreted by so many different Islamic sects. So like that whatever they're taught, there's so many ways that that could go. And it's the same way here when they start talking about like, well, but we need a country ran on biblical laws. And I'm like, well, who's going to interpret it? Like the Methodists, the Baptists, like, because that's stuff that like Iran and Pakistan, Afghanistan, like those countries are dealing with that because they do have religious rule, but
Yeah, no,
it's not
you're
monolithic.
you're right. And I was just getting I was going to do an appearance on NPR in Texas to talk about, they're talking about doing Bible readings down there. And the question you raise of like, well, whose religion, whose interpretation is one that they're starting to struggle with, because that is a theological choice. The state is by definition going to be preferring one religion, one narrow religion over others. And so that is inherently coercive, inherently divisive, and tramples the religious freedom of everybody. And there's two examples that I think are really useful. And the first is, we've done this before in this country, and it did not go well. The Philadelphia Bible riots is something that not a lot of people have learned about, but it's a really fascinating moment in American history, and it's the Protestant cultural hegemony kind of that I mentioned earlier. You know, it was really alive and well during the first attempts to create a public school system, and in 1844 in Philadelphia, this is just like a couple years after Philadelphia is created, maybe a decade after Philadelphia has created its public schools. And some schools are like, oh, we'll use the Bible to teach kids how to read, which is basically, you know, kind of what Texas is doing. And this led to those thorny questions that have bred religious violence throughout our history. Like, which version of the Bible is the real Bible? Which one are we going to force children to read in the schools they are required by law to attend? Are we going to do the Catholic or the Protestant? And those questions may seem, you know, distant today, but a riot ensued, and Philadelphia was literally engulfed in flames. Churches were set on fire. People were killed. And so it's this example, and there was certainly some other bigotry flying around at the time, you know, anti-Irish, anti-immigrant bigotry. But they're an example of what happens when the wall of separation between church and state breaks down, and the violence and divisiveness that wall holds at bay breaking through. And then there's another example that I think that is more modern, it's there are no real minor disagreements in religion, because religion is talking about the ultimate truths about life and existence. And so when we make the mistake of allowing religion to use the machinery of the state, you know, if we zoom in enough, at some point, right, you are going to disagree with the ruling religion. Whoever you are, listener, at some point, you're going to be the heretic. And without the separation of church and state, you're going to be vulnerable and unprotected. And the example I like to use is, what are we going to teach these kids in school? Do you want the government-approved scripture to say that Jesus's mother, Mary, was a virgin? Right? Because that's the popular interpretation of the phrase. Or should the government go with the interpretation young woman? And that's actually closer to the original Hebrew, and that's the scholarly consensus for what is an accurate translation. So the government has to choose one of those if kids are going to be reading the Bible in schools. Which should it choose? Virgin and popularity? Or should it go with accuracy and scholarship and choose young woman? Or is it better to just keep religious interpretations out of the hands of the government altogether? Maybe we don't want politicians deciding religious truth.
Right. I know when I took a class in college, we talked about the Texas Board of Education and David Barton, and I'm sure you've heard all that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
um, but even well, and maybe this still stands, but when major populated states like Texas or California or New York go to update their textbooks, because it's so expensive for other states to print textbooks, they'll hop on that state's order and then just have some chapters switched out for their specific state. So if Texas goes to update all these textbooks, there's a chance that someone like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama are also going to purchase those textbooks and then update them to have specific history. And I was thinking, I was like, just how influential that could be for Texas to be commandeered that way. And that, because I mean, Texas is like just posited as, and I'm from Texas, as just like the renegade kind of like, we don't take anything from anyone. Um, and it can get and even, like, with that and the Texas Board of Education, there's also been some rumors coming out about, like, banning Sharia law, like, legislating that, and I was like, "It's already legislated, the separation of church and state, you don't need
Yeah.
to
Covers it.
spend our" but again, it's that emotional. If they can just keep making you think that you're under threat,
Yeah.
uh
I mean, that definitely is the, like, they want you to be afraid and they want you to be afraid of non-Christians. I think politics, and especially sort of reactionary conservative right-wing politics throughout human history, have shown the effectiveness of finding a scapegoat. And we see that pretty regularly with the Christian nationalists in this country. I mean, just to take one example, like the scapegoating of trans people for all manner of crimes, while, like, everything that we are learning from this horrific drop of Epstein documents shows that no, it's just the elites. Like, there's no trans people that are in those files that are doing these horrific things. It's just rich billionaires who are essentially putting themselves above the law. But the scapegoating aspect of it and the turning, I mean, it goes so back through American history. Well, yeah, that's a whole other topic. I'll pause here.
No, and I'll hop in when in that Hegseth book, he talks
Yeah.
about how without the Crusades, there would be no the America. And really, like, I mean, he spends a good chunk talking about his devotion to studying the Crusades and why it's so important. And without the Crusades, we wouldn't have the Enlightenment, we wouldn't have America. And there's just a lot to unpack there. And um and I'm reading it and I'm just like, this is just so dangerous. This is not true. This is grossly oversimplifying a lot of things. And um yeah, it's the
It's got
ostrich.
and it's also got that flavor. Like, I don't know if you've read Kristen Kobes Dumay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, right? But there's this sort of, I think she calls it muscular Christianity, which I'm not the biggest fan of that phrase. But it's toxic masculinity married to conservative Christianity. I mean, maybe we just straight up call it the patriarchy, but it really is. It really is scapegoating everybody. I mean, and this goes to the central goal of white Christian nationalism. I mean, the whole purpose behind this movement is to elevate the chosen few, right? The straight, white, conservative, heteronormative Christian, and Christian is in scare quotes the right kind of Christian we're talking about, Christian man, at the expense of everybody else, right? So that straight white Christian man is going to be having all he wants under the law. He's going to be protected by the law, but he's not bound by it, right? The laws don't apply to him, and everybody else, whoever you may be, you are bound by the law. You're required to follow it, but you're not protected by it. I mean, and this is what we're seeing playing out on the streets of Minneapolis, right? This is the end goal of white Christian nationalism, to legally to set up this society where this narrow group of people is legally favored at the expense of everybody else. And it harkens back to the worst moments, not just in American history, the worst epics in our history, but the worst epics in human history.
They the the relationship that the government has with churches. People have said quite a bit, like there's so much power, so much influence. Um, a lot of folks have said, like, how come we're not churching taxes? Or how come we're not taxing churches? Can you shed some light on what that argument is, the pros and cons of taxing churches?
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the sort of most popular comments I see on social media, like the 3-word war cry, the tax the church. And I have I have like a book outline and maybe like 40 pages of a book written on this. Some of it while I was writing American Crusade, where it's like it kind of didn't really fit in with American Crusade, and I ended up having to pull it out. I mean, the short obvious lawyerly answer is in 1970, the Supreme Court was asked basically this question in a case called Walz, WALZ, v. Tax Commission. And it said, yeah, it's okay for churches to be tax exempt. But there are some finer points, I think, when you get into this more. And when I was doing some of the research for this, Justice Thurgood Marshall, who is it's just truly remarkable person, and one of the most pivotal figures in all of American legal history. He was the first Black Supreme Court justice, the first Black Solicitor General. That's the person who argues for the presidential administration at the Supreme Court. He was the founder and the chief counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the lawyer who argued Brown versus Board of Education and won it. Like, I mean, this man is a fucking titan. And he eventually became a Supreme Court justice. I was digging through his papers and I found a note, a little handwritten note in one of his just little sidebar. Like the Supreme Court justices are really, really secretive, and you don't get to see their personal papers up until like 40 or 50 years after their death. They're very, very, very secretive. And in fact, we just found out John Roberts is making them sign, people who work at the Supreme Court sign NDAs, which is crazy. Anyway, like, so you like, it's not like a big thing when they die, you get to see all their papers. You don't like, there's no transparency at the Supreme Court. So there's never tends to be like these big releases like we're seeing now with it. Anyway, so I found this little note, and he says in there, churches should pay property and income taxes. And I'm just like, oh, yeah, buddy.
Are you getting
We're
a alert?
getting a silver alert. Yeah,
Ah,
so even when your phone's on mute, it still goes through.
that's right.
Anyway, so
Whoa.
even when you're even like one of these titans of the Supreme Court is like, hey, this is a thing. And you can go back and some of the earlier cases, like there's a case called Zorach v. Clausen. Not my favorite case. There's a 6-justice majority in there, though, that says if there's no church-state separation, which there is not really now, then the taxes are fine. In other words, and the quote is, churches could not be required to pay even property taxes, right? So there's actually good, and there have been some really interesting scholarly articles written on this. The short version is that case from 1970 says, yeah, churches can be tax exempt. I think there certainly is some good and interesting evidence, and for me the more fascinating thing is a lot of the churches and a lot of these religious schools that popped up really after desegregation, after Marshall won that Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? Like, they started trying to figure out ways to get around it and to maintain segregation. And you have these churches and these religious schools that are tax exempt discriminating. And you have the government saying, well, hey, that's not in the public interest. Like, it's not what we want people to be doing with their tax exemption. You're discriminating, so you don't get to be tax exempt. And this kind of all comes to a head under Reagan, and that at that moment, so many terrible things trace back to Reagan. It became verboten to even discuss taxing churches or churches losing their tax exempt status, or same with Christian schools. But I do think there is an argument to be made that some of them certainly shouldn't. And I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that we could tie that to the public good in some way, shape, or form, whatever that might mean. Like, have a soup kitchen if you want to actually like do some good. But I don't know if I'm going to write that book. I got like 10 other books ahead of that, and then like 40 books in the folder that I'm contemplating. So we'll see. But yeah, maybe someday.
Because it does. I think like some of the concerns I've read that if you were to tax them, then like suddenly you have now made them some sort of a pack in a way or something, a micro pack. I
Yeah.
don't.
So that's what you're thinking of is the Johnson Amendment,
Okay.
and that is worth spending a few minutes on, because just this morning at the National Prayer Breakfast, Trump lied and said that he destroyed the Johnson Amendment and that it's gone, and that's just not true. The Johnson Amendment is a very simple rule. It's a very important rule, and it says that tax exempt organizations, right? So things that are 501c3s, houses of worship, charities, the usual thing that you're donating to and taking that tax write-off, it's a 501c3 or the equivalent. Johnson Amendment says that if you're a C3 or a house of worship, you can't engage in partisan politics. Right. So all it is, it's a string attached to that tax exempt status. And the string is meant to ensure that people who are donating to charities, that those charitable donations are going to charitable works. Right. We don't want people to be able to donate to a charity and then have that money go to a partisan political campaign. Right. That doesn't make sense. By all means, go donate to a partisan political campaign if you want. We're just not going to give you a tax write-off. It's not going to be part of the tax exempt system if you want to do that. Right? So it's a very basic, very simple, common sense rule. And it's a rule, by the way, that everybody loves. The clergy love it. Churches love it. Nonprofits love it. Donors love it. Literally every fucking buddy loves it, except for this very narrow. I should have asked if I can curse on your podcast. I
Yeah,
hope that's
for sure. Totally.
There's a very narrow group of Christian nationalists, legal entities, and kind of mega churches, and some of the more conservative Trump supporting churches that want to get involved in partisan politics and have been trying to get the Johnson Amendment overturned, struck down for 2 decades, unsuccessfully. Courts have looked at the Johnson Amendment. They've said it's constitutional. It doesn't violate free speech. It doesn't violate the religious freedom of churches, right? And that's because if churches want to endorse political candidates, they can. They just have to pay taxes, right? It's like you don't have a right to be tax exempt, though that's what they're arguing. So the problem is, if the Johnson Amendment were to go away tomorrow, churches would become if the Johnson Amendment disappears, I think it'll actually end up being worse than Citizens United. And that's because right now churches do not file any financial disclosures with the IRS. They are just black holes. We have no idea how much money comes in or goes out, unless they are voluntarily doing some sort of, audit and then publishing that. But there are some that do that, but it's rare and it's voluntary. So every other C3 in the country has to file disclosures with the IRS. For bigger nonprofits, it's a Form 990. It tracks every penny that goes in and every penny that goes out. You can see where your tax deductible donations are going. And the reason we do that is because this is a public trust, right? Like your tax exempt status is a public trust, and we, the public, have an interest in ensuring that it is not being used, or rather it's not being abused. And so if it goes away, you have a situation where churches can take in unlimited amounts of money from anybody and turn around and spend it on partisan political elections, and we will have no idea. There's no transparency, no disclosure requirements. And if anybody were to go after them, the administration, the IRS, they will turn around and claim religious freedom. And so if you are, let's just say, a billionaire, maybe you own a couple tech companies and a space company, something like that, and you want to sway the outcome of an election, not an unheard of hypothetical, you can turn around and give 20, 50, $100 million to a church, and that church can pump whatever it wants into the election, and that's it. There's nothing that can be done. There's no way to know. We won't know. And it will, I mean, it will be an utter nightmare. And I think it will make, though it is something that would be enabled by Citizens United, I think it would make Citizens United look like the good old days.
Thank you for explaining all of that, because I was a little confused on what was going on, especially because you brought up the prayer breakfast where there were a couple of lies
Yeah.
delivered.
And I'll
I
just say, I mean, that's a really confusing, and such an important rule, and we do such a bad job talking about it. I wrote an op-ed for Rolling Stone on it. If people want to consult that, it's got a little bit. I tried to be a little clearer from maybe a couple months ago, but it's a big deal. Yeah,
Thank you. And thank you for publicizing it and bringing attention to it, because folks, I don't think really understood what Citizens United was at the time. I mean, and
yeah,
now we're just getting steamrolled. Um, I want to talk a little bit about that national prayer breakfast that we had this morning, DC. Folks, this is I guess it's an annual tradition, that's gone since the 50s, I want to say.
mm-hmm.
And it's a bunch of religious leaders meeting with the president for breakfast, kind of a State of the Union, faith-wise, I guess, which I really struggled with just in general. Like how can all how I don't know how you can call yourself a faith leader and go to that breakfast after, particularly after this recent Epstein file drop. But I've also asked that question a lot of times along the way. But one thing that I know that coming out is, you talked about the Johnson Amendment and how Trump tried to muddy the waters on that. But he also said that they were going to rededicate America as a Christian a nation under God. It's
Yeah.
felt a little weird. God's on the currency, God's on the pledge. When he says things like that, what are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, immediately. So he said May 17th for that, which is a Sunday, but May 7th is the National Day of Prayer. And some of the language he was using is reminiscent of other things about the National Day of Prayer. I mean, that's definitely something we were going to look into. I mean, I was texting some friends and chatting with some other activists who I think are probably going to take some action. We will certainly be looking at it. That's the first we've kind of heard of this. But, we knew going into the 250th of the Declaration of Independence that it was going to be a year where Christian nationalist disinformation was just going to be pumped out in just waterfalls by this administration. So I'm not surprised to see something like that. Americans United for Separation of Church and State, AU.org, is on the front lines fighting against that. If people want to join and stay informed, I would really recommend that you support us financially at AU.org, because it's really, I mean, we are in the fight of our lives. If you care about real religious freedom and the separation of church and state, now's the time to pony up. But that's going to be something that my team was into it within 20 seconds of him saying that, and we've already got a lot of things going on it. But more, stay tuned is the short answer for that.
Absolutely. They the book
And
Founding
Lee, real
Myth.
quick, just so you know, I do have to go in 4.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
was
Okay.
just about to
Yeah.
um
Sorry.
to talk about, you've just asked for support for AU.
Yeah.
Folks, he also has the book Founding Myth. Here it is, just a little, I know I've got a glare. You can see all the tabs that I've done because, like I
It's the
said,
best. I love it. I love
and
it.
then here again for the American Crusade. Where can folks follow you, buy your books? How can they learn
Yeah.
more about you?
Yeah, I mean, I really recommend people go support their public library. Tell if your library doesn't have a copy, tell them to get one. Otherwise, I have a profile on bookshop.org, both as an author and as like a book nerd slash bookworm slash book dragon. I love doing lists over there. I've got like a reading list on Christian nationalism and books to make you rethink everything, and my favorite reads of 2025, fiction and nonfiction. You know, I've got a website, Andrew L. Seidel. I'm Andrew L. Seidel pretty much everywhere. Seidel. And then I do have a podcast, One Nation Indivisible, that I do weekly, though. I don't know how much we're going to continue with the weekly. If I do start writing another book, we'll see. We might have to dial it back a little bit. But I love hearing from folks, so hit me up on social, not in a DM. Just go with the public. My DMs are too flooded and sometimes gross, as I'm sure anybody who lives on social media knows.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been just a pleasure and an honor. And thank you for your books and all the efforts that you are doing to protect our country from some pretty bad actors that are perverting some pretty sacred objects and names. So thank you for everything that you're doing. Um, Folks, that is the end of our episode. That is Follow the Leader. I'm your host, Lee Larson. Again, that's Andrew Seidel. I'm Lee. He's the guest. I'm the host. But y'all go ahead and like, follow, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see y'all next time. See ya.
Thank you, Lee.
Um,